Well, shalom everyone. Dr. Dinah Dye here, and Hag Chanukah Sameach. And we're going to approach Hanukkah in a little bit different way. Each year that we teach, sometimes it's hard to come up with a different angle on Hanukkah. So I decided to go back and look more closely at John 10:22, because that really is one of our only mentions of Hanukkah, actual mention of Hanukkah in the scriptures. So this session's called The Good Shepherd and the Light at Hanukkah, and I'm going to tie the two of them together. So if we go to John 10:22, it says that then came Hanukkah, the Feast of Dedication. It was winter in Jerusalem. Yeshua was walking in the temple around Solomon's colonnade, and the Judean leaders surrounded him and said, "How long will you hold us in doubt?" That word there, doubt, was kind of interesting. As I looked it up, I think that translation isn't that great, but it more or less means, how long will you hold us or threaten our psyche or threaten our soul? So that it's not just sort of a lightweight, well, I guess I'm not sure about this. This is something that is challenging them in the very depths of their being. And as I mentioned, this is really the only mention that we have of Hanukkah in the Bible. So I thought I'd go back, we need to kind of look at the context and the culture and history from John 10, but even going back further. And I think it's important as well as to view the whole book of John if we're going to analyze the context. So I would just encourage you in this season to actually read the entire book of John, so that when you do come to John chapter 10, you'll see Hanukkah within that context. I think that over and above the message for John 10, really for the message of all of John, is the message of God's presence in their midst. It's the historical reality for them as we read the various stories in John. So if we can think of that as our backdrop, the presence of God in our midst, the presence of God in the midst of Judea at the time. And what did that look like? So just briefly looking at the book of John, we can say pretty comfortably that it looks like a new Genesis, because John is starting with in the beginning, obviously trying to take us back to the creation, Genesis chapter 1. So in the beginning. This really does echo for us, the book of John does, creation language all through. And we're watching the unfolding of humans being made in the divine image, just as we've seen in the book of Genesis. And there's plenty of temple imagery in the book of John. Just looking at the very first chapter, we see that the Word became flesh and tabernacled among us. So it's giving us an allusion to the tabernacle in the wilderness. Again, the idea of the presence of God being in the midst of the people, the significance of God's return, his Spirit returning to the presence of the people. So John's gospel, in essence, is showing us the way of creation, how creation is renewed and restored, and how the presence of God returns. Again, that's going to be our context when we get to John chapter 10. We also see in the entire book of John that Yeshua repeatedly going up to the temple, more so than any of the other gospels. And so a lot of the times as he's going up to Jerusalem, to the temple, there is a festival that is happening. So there's a lot of festival language in the book of John. And as we lead up to John chapter 10, it's important to look at 7 through 9, which is clearly the festival of Sukkot. And we do have an important tie between the two festivals based on the concept of light. And if you'll remember, for the festival of Sukkot, the light of the world in the court of the women, the 4 great posts with the vats of oil. We'll talk about that in a little more detail. John is really telling us how the Creator came at last to remake the world. And I really like this quote from N.T. Wright. In it, he says, "One through whom the world is made becomes the one through whom the world is rescued." So we know that Yeshua, in many ways, is taking on the role of Israel itself. Israel had a function and purpose to go and rescue the world from its enslavement to sin. And so Yeshua, then playing the role of Israel, is come to rescue the world in kind of the same way. It was Israel's mandate to rescue the nations, and so Yeshua takes on that function to rescue the nations. And we can see that in the book of John, not only is John taking us through sort of the renewal of creation, but it's also, the book is showing us, as do all the other Gospels and really the entire New Testament, what the new Exodus looks like with Yeshua functioning or playing the part, if you will, of Moses. And so both Moses and Yeshua in the scriptures are referred to as the Good Shepherd, and both of them are tied to light. And it's more obvious when we see Yeshua, who in fact calls himself the light of the world. But if we go back to Exodus 2, verse 2, you'll remember it's talking about Jochebed bearing a son, and she saw that the son she bore was good. So that's just not some adjective they threw in there and go, he's a good baby. The idea of good really will take us back to Genesis 1:4. It really should, because it tells us there, as God is creating the cosmos, as God is building the house, the temple, it says that God saw the light, and the light was good. I think it's an intentional connection there to show that Moses is connected to that light that would bring forth life and order in the same way. So both Moses and Yeshua functioning as great shepherds and as the light of the world. And so it is the case that both creation and Exodus seem to be bound up in the book of John. And I think that's important to remember as we get to the Hanukkah story. You'll remember, of course, Moses as the good shepherd. And we're going to talk about shepherds more in just a moment. But he is the one who would approach Pharaoh, and he would be the one to lead the children of Israel out of Egypt. He would take them into the wilderness. They would build a tabernacle. He would be given the Torah, the commandments of God, the instruction for the nation. And then this paved the way for God himself, Yahweh, to dwell in the midst of them. Well, you'll remember maybe that Joshua, when he was commissioned by Moses to take on the leadership of the nation, he is referred to as the shepherd ruler. And he will be taking the nation from the wilderness across the Jordan River and entering into the land, ultimately to go to Shiloh, where he will be a part of erecting the tabernacle and then the service of the tabernacle. It was in Gilgal before that, but ultimately when they erected in Shiloh, it was sort of a half-temporary permanent structure. And you can find that in Numbers 28. Interestingly enough, after we see that Joshua's commissioned to be the shepherd, to lead the children of Israel into the land, chapter 29 of Numbers takes us to the map here of the festivals as we go through all the various festivals that are going to function within that context. We also see David, of course, he was the shepherd, another example of a good shepherd, and his responsibility was to defeat Israel's enemies in order to pave the way for Solomon to build the temple. And ultimately, we see that Yeshua is going to lead those that are his, of Yehuda, out of bondage, and he is going to function as the living Torah, and his body raised up would become the dwelling place for God in his person. And so all of this language, again, related to the temple, is seeing the restoration of the presence of God in their midst. The idea of the Spirit, the renewal of the Spirit. This is taking us up again to John chapter 10, and of course throughout the rest of the book of John. John chapter 10 talks about Yeshua in regards to him being the gate or the door or the tabernacle itself. All of this implying that the presence of God has returned, and he is the one to lead his people, who will eventually, his people, become the tabernacle for the presence of God in their midst as manifested by the Spirit. So in order to really get a grasp on what's happening politically and historically in John chapter 10, we got to go back and kind of survey the history of things leading up. And I'm not going to go into the entire story of Hanukkah, the political story and the Maccabees, but just to try to remind you of some things that are kind of important in order for us to understand who the players are in John 10. So if you'll recall, after Alexander the Great, the empire was divided up into four, and basically we end up with the Seleucids, who are basically Syria, and the Ptolemies, Egypt. And the Seleucids take power about 200 BCE. And Yehuda is essentially sandwiched in between the two, depending on who's in charge. So at this juncture, Yehuda, Judah, is under the rule of the Seleucids. We have the last of the Zadokite high priests to rule over Judah, and that's Shimon ben Onias. And interestingly enough, language that they refer to him, something they call him the morning star in the midst of the clouds, or as the full moon. So you see that light imagery. And this was quite typical of associating high priest king, if you will, with the one who would come with the light. So he eventually flees to Egypt, but we see at this juncture in comes Antiochus Epiphanes, or Antiochus, however you want to say it, and the great persecution begins for Judah, and we see the revolt of the Maccabees at this time. And again, Onias flees, so there is no high priest, and he is the last of the Zadokite rulers of the high priesthood. Under Antiochus Epiphanes, there are tremendous Hellenistic reforms, and this creates great conflict for the Jews and results in open revolt. Interestingly enough, at the same time, the upper classes of Judea were quite happy with the entire thing, and they rose up in power. They essentially became the priests connected to the aristocracy. So they really embraced the Hellenistic reforms. Now, the office of high priest, for all intents and purposes, was eliminated under Antiochus Epiphanes. And Antiochus was responsible for rededicating the temple in Jerusalem to the Greek gods. He outlawed the Torah, and things such as circumcision were violations that resulted in execution. So it was a very oppressive, brutal time for the folks that lived in Judah. The Hasidim, the pious ones, escaped out to the country to hide from the Greeks, but the Greeks hunted them down, slayed them, massacred them, and there was no getting away from the Greeks at that time. So Judah, a Maccabee of the family, the Maccabee family, is one who leads a rebellion against Antiochus Epiphanes and the Seleucid rulers, and the Seleucids. And it was said that he was brilliant in guerrilla warfare. And so he rose up, interestingly enough as well, he made alliances with both Sparta and Rome in order to seek protection. So they provided a measure of protection against Antiochus, the Seleucid king. And another interesting fact related to this period is that they had essentially reinterpreted the Torah, if you will, so that they would be able to fight defensively on the Sabbath, because much of the peril that they had run into was because they did not fight on the Sabbath. So that's kind of another interesting thing that took place there. Now, we all know the story of Hanukkah with the cruse of oil, the temple they took within the temple, they found the cruse of oil. It had the seal of the high priest Onias. You'll remember he was the last of the Zadokite high priests and the one who had escaped to Egypt. And so they were able to rekindle the menorah, the eternal light. Here we have that concept of the light and the essence of that light being eternal in nature. We see under the Maccabees the rededication of the temple. And so all of that is that restoration of the temple and the light. At the same time, Judah, Maccabee, had essentially achieved independence for the Jewish state. So that's really big, because if you'll remember, Israel had spent most of her existence under the oppression of some foreign entity or another. Of course, when King David rose to power and handed off to his heir Solomon, we have a period in which the kings of Judah are ruling, but a lot of them are very oppressive as well. And so once King Nebuchadnezzar came and destroyed the temple and hauled off the best and brightest to Babylon, there's a breakdown at that point because they have lost not only the high priesthood, but also the kingship. And so they really have not functioned as an independent state for very long. Now, the Hasmoneans at that time would not allow Onias, even though they had taken control, would not allow Onias to return to his office as high priest. So there's a lot of drama going on. This is a fairly complex period, and again, I would just encourage you to, the more you understand the history of the period, the better it will be for understanding the backdrop for the scriptures. But the youngest of the Maccabees, Simon, took out one of the main threats, which was the Tobiads, which was around 142 BCE. And he declared himself to be high priest. So this is significant because we see the Hasmoneans take on offices and responsibility that was not theirs. And so Simon refers to himself as high priest. He calls himself the Nasi, or the prince. And you can see that that family, the Maccabees, the Hasmonean dynasty, is taking on royal titles. As Judah is now functioning as a sovereign state, Simon himself is king and high priest. So this is very significant as we move into the time of the first century. And it was also at this time, with Simon taking on that responsibility, that the Seleucid kingdom does start to crumble. And that's because of the onslaught coming by the Romans from the west and the Neo-Persians from the east. Now we have two significant Hasmonean rulers, John Hyrcanus and his son Alexander Yanai. And they are responsible for a lot of trauma in the land. They, of course, expanded the kingdom. They conquered the Galilee and Idumea, and they were responsible for forcing the Gentiles to convert to Judaism. Now, we don't see this happening in the course of history of the Jewish people, but at this particular juncture, that's what's going on. So this military expansion didn't particularly benefit the Jewish people, and the Jewish people were not happy with the Hasmoneans. The John Hyrcanus and his son Yanai, Alexander Yanai, were brutal. They crucified their political foes, and they functioned as absolute monarchs. So here we go again. Israel, Judah in particular, under the oppression of tyranny, really, at that time under the Hasmoneans. It was said that Alexander Yanai, crucified thousands of Pharisees all at one time. So the other thing they did was centralize power and rule with a strong arm over Judah as the high priest and king. And so they continually passed that down. And as an interesting aside, it was noted that Yanai, who gave himself the title of high priest, was once pelted with etragim at a Sukkot near the altar in Jerusalem, so in the temple. So not well liked were these guys. And they continually contended for power until essentially they were stopped by the Roman general Pompey. And that was in 63 BCE, who claimed Judea for Rome. And it was said that Pompey himself, when he came into Jerusalem, into the temple, entered into the inner sanctum. He was also responsible for massacring large numbers of priests. At that time, there was a civil war between Pompey and Julius Caesar, and the Jews supported Julius, who was kind of, he did things that benefited them over Pompey. In fact, Julius Caesar was one who excused the Jews from emperor worship at the time. So bit by bit by bit, the Hasmoneans lost power. And ultimately, Rome, Pompey, and then Rome comes in and declares Herod the Great, who will now become the king. And under him, they will form a large bureaucracy of priests, most of the noble line. And these people become the ruling class of Judea. Now, these they are not the rightful heirs to the kingship or the rightful heirs to the priesthood. And that's going to become a very important point when we get to John chapter 10. This is quite significant, and I do believe this is what Yeshua is railing against. So Herod the Great is, for all intents and purposes, pro-Roman and ruling over the small state of Judea. Mark Antony recognized Herod as a natural leader, made him the Jewish leader, and ultimately under the Roman Senate. So Herod was not independent. He may have had an independent state to rule over, but he was anything but independent. And he was under the control of Rome. His rule ended in terror, and for essentially, he was more of a Roman king than he was a Jewish king. So when we go back to John 10, what's been going on historically seems to be popping up. And as Yeshua is you remember, he's in the temple. It's winter. It's the Feast of Dedication. And he's making a contrast here between the Good Shepherd and the wolf. So is it the case that Herod the Great, although at the time of Yeshua he's dead, but the line of the Herodian dynasty, are they the ones that came to devour the sheep? And I mentioned we are going to talk in a little more detail about what shepherds were in the ancient world. So Herod the Great was responsible for rebuilding the temple along about 20 of BCE, and he did that on, obviously for himself, but to win the hearts and minds of his subjects as well. At that time, his crowning achievement was the port of Caesarea, and he had built that in honor of the Emperor Augustus. And it was said that that port rivaled Alexandria. It was massive and high technology involved in building. Any of you who've been to Caesarea have seen that. It's quite something to see. So back to the Hanukkah celebration, of course, was related to the deliverance of the Jewish people from the Greeks, from Antiochus Epiphanes. And it begs the question of how we came up with Kislev 25. How did the Maccabees decide on that particular date? And it appears that could well be based on the prophet Haggai. And I, again, encourage you not only to read all of John, but of course read the book of Haggai, which is very short. And it's all about the rebuilding of the temple and all of the problems that the Jews came up against in trying to rebuild. But Haggai was the prophet who was calling the people to rebuild after the exiles came back from Babylon. Of course, the monarchy had been completely upended. Jeconiah was under him. The Jewish people began to be removed by Nebuchadnezzar and taken to Babylon. And within that, you can see Jeconiah, the royal line is now in jeopardy, essentially being cut off from the Davidic dynasty. And the one who will pick it up, who doesn't actually seem to ever serve as king, is going to be Zerubbabel. And what's interesting you can find traces of him when you read Matthew chapter 1, when we have the genealogy there. And as we see, takes us through the royal dynasty and takes us from Zerubbabel through various ones to Yeshua. We'll talk about that as well in a minute. So Zerubbabel, a lot of what we see being spoken of in the book of Zechariah and Haggai, etc., is referring to Zerubbabel, because he is the royal seed of David and of the royal household. And I know when we approach those books, we filter it through the idea of prophecy, and obviously that has a place, but I think historically, if we understand who's being spoken of here, and most of it, Zerubbabel as the king and Jehozadak as the high priest, both were the legitimate heirs. So Zerubbabel is the legitimate heir king to the throne from David, and Jehozadak is the legitimate the priestly line going all the way back to Aaron. So in Zechariah and Haggai, and speaking of Zechariah, who is the governor, and he is serving under Darius, the Medo-Persian king. Now this is going back from the first century, clearly. And he was to shepherd his people. This was the role of the king. And there was a certain amount of restoration of the altar and the burnt offering and resuming the daily sacrifices. We see all that taking place. After the Babylonian exile, again in Matthew chapter 1, read that. We'll see from Shealtiel, his father, to Zerubbabel, on down to Joseph, the husband of Miriam. So it's giving us a very clear look into the line and how it was supposed to function. Again, Haggai is about rebuilding the temple. And as we get to the last chapter in Haggai, it says that from this day forward, I will bless you, your seed will be stored in the storehouse. And so the day that's referred to there is Kislev 24. So from this day forward would be Kislev 25. So it's very likely that the Maccabees took that date, and that became the Feast of Dedication, the festival of Chanukah. It goes on to say in Haggai that I will overturn the throne of kingdoms and destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the nations. So we see, once again, this is the reality for Israel, for Judah, through the millennia of being oppressed by the nations and the kingdoms of this world, and that God would raise them up. And it says, on that day, I will take Zerubbabel and set him like a signet. So that's telling us, that's some kingship language, declaring Zerubbabel is the rightful heir to the throne. He is of the Davidic kingship that will be restored. So this time in the rebuilding of the temple, we see that going back to the time of Zerubbabel, that the Jews have faced many, many difficulties and obstacles in completing the temple. The Jews that were living in Babylon didn't believe it had ever even be built. And so Zechariah the prophet continually encouraged them to rebuild, and that not to let their resolve weaken just because of all of the chatter from the exiles. And so within chapter 9 of Zechariah, it talks about rejoice, your king is coming, righteous, bringing salvation, lowly, riding on a donkey. Of course, we understand that in the context to be our future Messiah, Yeshua, but is also speaking historically, probably going back to Solomon and then coming forward to Zerubbabel, who was essentially the right king. But of course, it doesn't manifest itself at that time. But the idea of them rejoicing that the king is coming is telling, and that he is lowly riding on a donkey, suggests the coronation ceremony is being alluded to here. And so that means that there is a temple that has been built if we have a coronation. So the king would only be crowned and have a place to be seated on the throne if there was actually a throne to be seated on. So Zechariah, we mentioned Zechariah 9, rejoice that your king is coming. But in Zechariah 10, now it starts to describe the people wandering like sheep, afflicted because they have no shepherd. And it tells us that God's anger is burning against the shepherds, and that God himself cares for his flock, the house of Judah. So just kind of want to plant that in because this language is picked up in John chapter 10. Also in Zechariah 9, it goes on to say that Judah will become the cornerstone, and from him the tent peg. So we have, again, allusions here to the building of the temple, the cornerstone, the foundation of the physical building of the temple, and then from him the tent peg is referring us to the tabernacle, that he is the one who would tabernacle amongst us. So again, yes, allusions to Yeshua, who would be coming in the first century, but also I think a measure here connected to Zerubbabel and the dynastic line of David, even though we have hundreds of years here where the Hasmoneans took over illegitimately and the Herodians. So the cornerstone talked about as being the living stone chosen by God. And of course, 1 Peter has an allusion to the same concept of we as a royal priesthood and a holy nation and a chosen people functioning as living stones in the temple. So let's talk about shepherds here for a moment, because in the ancient world, human rulers were shepherds and their subjects were sheep. And this is language. Shepherd language is language of the royal line and divine title. So if we go back in scripture, we know Abraham was a shepherd, and Jacob, and Moses, Joshua, David, even a mention of King Cyrus, the Persian, who was the shepherd, because this is a term for a ruler in the ancient Near East tradition, referring to the gods and the deities and kings' titles. That's how they viewed it. So, for example, Marduk, who was the chief god of the pantheon for Babylon, the Neo-Babylonian Empire, he was called the shepherd of human beings. From the creation story in Babylon, Enuma Elish, he was called a faithful shepherd. Hammurabi, from the Code of Hammurabi, you might remember, he was called the shepherd selected by Enlil, the god Enlil. And ultimately, King Nebuchadnezzar says of himself that Marduk gave me the shepherdship. And there's a myriad of examples. But this is important to understand, because if we're going to understand John 10, we need to understand the concept of shepherd. What's Yeshua really saying that he's the good shepherd? So there's a connection between royalty and shepherding. The staff, of course, symbolized the ruler's power, his eminence, his very nature. The title represented the divinity and human leadership as one. And it was the idea of shepherd was it was the king's ability to take care of his subjects, and that the king exercised his power in order to protect his subjects, his sheep, from enemies. Again, that will become important in John 10. And there's a special term that's used, ma'at. This is the obligation of the shepherd king to maintain order and justice and righteousness in that context. So again, we have a lot of shepherd language in John chapter 10. We kind of want to look at it from the context of ruling and reigning and righteousness and justice, that type of a king. So let's go back into John as we kind of surveyed the history leading up to the first century. And we mentioned that John 1, of course, is a replay of creation in the beginning. And as we go down for first few verses, it tells us that in him was life, and that life was the light of men. So now we have this light language that we had in creation. The idea of light is to bring forth order. It's to bring forth, to remove the chaos that is created by the nations' kings, and out of this, the light of men, to draw men to that light and to be restored. This is new creation type language. The life was the light of men. And so again, Genesis and John are both referring to creation, and then they are speaking of the new light of creation, the new order of creation. And that order signifies that the right king is seated on the throne. This idea of light associated with the eternal light, the dynastic aspects of rulership, divine order, and what also is associated with that is wisdom. Because anciently the kings were given wisdom to rule. So wisdom was associated with oil, and the oil was associated with the light. So all of these themes come to bear. So as I mentioned, if we're going to look at John 10, we need to actually look at the entire book of John. But in particular, we're going to focus on chapters 7 through 11 as the backdrop for John chapter 10. So we see from 7 to 11, it is the festival of Sukkot. We have imagery of the Spirit and of water. We see rivers of living water flowing from the innermost belly. We see the light of the world at Sukkot, and it takes us all the way to the resurrection of Lazarus in John chapter 11. So, of course, Sukkot in the fall, Hanukkah is associated with Sukkot. Of course, both are in essence 8 days, Sukkot being 7th plus the additional day. And it was in John chapter 7, it tells us that Yeshua went up to the temple once again during the intermediate days of Sukkot, Chol HaMoed. And what's interesting with that as well is there's a traditional reading from the Haftorah during that time, from Ezekiel 38 and 39. Of course, you might recognize that as the War of Gog and Magog. And while we could debate who in the future Gog and Magog might represent, anciently it was referring to King Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon. All armies had to come from the north, and so from Babylon you would come over and around and down from the north to attack. You'll recall even in the book of Zechariah 14:16 talks about the celebration of Sukkot after the war, when the survivors of the nations would come up to Jerusalem to worship. So that's kind of significant in John chapter 10 as well, the idea of the nations turning to their Messiah, to their king. And it was said that in John chapter 7, on the last day, Yeshua stands and says, "Let him come to me and drink, and out of his belly will flow rivers of living water." So this was the idea of the return of the presence of God in their midst, the idea of receiving the Ruach as it was at creation. You'll remember that the Spirit was hovering over the waters at creation, and this was this act of bringing forth life at creation. So the Spirit once again. When we move into John chapter 8, we see, again, it's Sukkot, the ends of Sukkot, and Yeshua is declaring that I am the light of the world, taking us back to the creation language, bringing order and wisdom and life and setting the king on the throne. So it's interesting, again, at Sukkot, we have the 4 great posts that are erected in the court of the women at that time. There's 4, each post has a large vat filled with oil, and the swaddling cloths, which were the undergarments of the priests, served as the wicks. And they would light that the oil at the time of Sukkot, and was said you could see in every nook and cranny and corner of Jerusalem that it was so bright. And it was at this backdrop that Yeshua is saying, I am the light of the world. The one who follows me will no longer walk in darkness. And so we see this idea of seeing, of vision, of being given wisdom to see. This is what the light of God would bring forth in relationship to the oil. The oil was tied to wisdom. And again, the whole construct here was to bring order out of chaos, that the enemies of God created chaos, and that God himself brought order as his divine presence came into our midst. Yeshua would go on to say, I know where I came from and where I'm going. And they ask, where is your father? This is all sort of very strange language, really. And Yeshua responded, you don't know neither me nor my father. And I thought it was interesting because it said that he spoke these words from the treasury in the temple. And that really, the treasury was really kind of a manifestation of where the heart of the elites was. That was where their power and control resided, in the treasury, because as the Bible says often, the love of money is the root of all evil. And so how the elites maintained, and that would be the priestly class, how they maintained control was, of course, over controlling controlling over the money and how the money was spent and where the money was spent, etc. And Yeshua goes on to tell them, I am from above and you are from below, the place where you will die of your sins. So this is all very kind of random, to me, very strange type language, but he is telling us he knows where he's going and where he came from, is the idea of the presence of God returning, leading and guiding him and showing him the presence of God within him, showing him where he will go and what he will say, and that he understands who he is and where he came from, versus these guys who have abdicated their covenant relationship with God, have no idea. They don't even know who their father is. So we jump into John chapter 9. This is the whole story of the blind man who's given sight, which I think is, to me, all of this is just connected. And of course, his eyes were opened. And it says, for judgment I came into this world, so that those who don't see may see, and those who do see will become blind. So he's speaking of the ones who have no power, the downtrodden and the innocent and the vulnerable, but those who will become blind after we've just come out of I am the light of the world discussion at Sukkot. He's speaking of the leadership, the corrupt leadership. Now, not everybody was corrupt, but the temple leadership, Annas and his Caiaphas, it wasn't his son, grandson, I can't remember. Someone will correct me. But Caiaphas is kind of running the show at the time of Yeshua. But that whole structure had become very corrupt. And you'll remember, they've taken on the role of king and high priest illegitimately. None of them they were not from the royal line of David in any way. And Yeshua says that while I'm in the world, I am the light of the world. And he takes this man and he basically mixes the saliva in the dirt, creates mud, and he puts it on his eyes. And where does the blind man go? He goes to the pool of Shiloach, of Siloam, which means the pool of scent. The idea of that pool represented the spirit and a return back to creation. Now you might recall that the high priest would go down to the pool of Shiloach at Sukkot and take the golden vessel and dip it into the water. It took out a measure of water, and he would go back up to the temple, and he would pour out the water on the altar and go down into the little bowls they had in the conduits and would run down under the altar and essentially back to the Gihon, which was said to be the waters of creation. So it's the idea of the return of the Spirit, the active element of the Spirit that would bring forth life. So the question begs, was the blind man there? Did he see the ceremony at the pool of Shiloach? His eyes were open and he could see that represented that the wisdom of God, the order of God, the life of God, the light of God had come upon this man, and he could see. And so was it the case that he saw the lights in the court of the women? Is it the case that he was down at the water drawing ceremony at Sukkot? But that all is a precursor for when we get to chapter 10. All of that just to get to John chapter 10. So we'll kind of, in the minutes that we have remaining, conclude with, let's just focus on that chapter. And it talks about the shepherd who leads the flock is leading the flock out of the sheepfold. And so anciently the sheepfold was referred to the sort of the temple complex. You'll recall in Psalm 23, green pastures was a reference to the temple because it was a reference to returning to Eden. And the idea of the temple was that it was a reflection of Eden's mountain and Eden's environment. So this is very much language of going back to Eden and the creation. And we see that Yeshua tells us that he's the door and the good shepherd. Interesting enough. So this has royal dimensions to it. He is making the claim that he is the true king of Judah. Now, try to imagine what that was like. He's in the temple. It's the Feast of Dedication, and he is declaring himself to be the true shepherd of Israel. This is probably not going over well with the leadership. So we came through the Hasmoneans. They were illegitimate. We came through the Herodians, illegitimate, and of course, and Rome is ruling over him. So he is distinguishing himself from those two dynasties, the Hasmonean dynasty and the Herodian dynasty, and that they had become entirely corrupt. And so it was the case that Yeshua chose Chanukah to advance creational order, to declare the return of God's presence in their midst. Of course, God's presence will dwell in his midst, and he will lead the flock out of the sheepfold, which is kind of wild for the time, but that domain had been corrupted. And so he was making a declaration that he is the king, and this place is not going to stay standing because of its corruption. So I think, my opinion, that he was attempting to remove the connection of Hanukkah with the previous corruption of the Hasmonean dynasty. And he was making the declaration that he was restoring Hanukkah to its proper place in the Davidic dynasty. That's the key. The true cleansing of the temple, the true dedication of the temple, the true light of the menorah, the place where wisdom truly was located, was within the confines of the Davidic dynasty. And so he was taking his sheep out of the sheepfold, the current dynastic rule, and he's going to take them to the true King of Kings, which is, of course, himself, the son of David. Kind of like Moses taking the children of Israel out of the pasture land of Goshen into the wilderness to build a tabernacle, so that there was a place for the presence of God to be restored. And so in light of that, I would just suggest that the Hasmoneans, the Herodians, whoever's running the show, the essence at the time, are the ones that came to kill and steal and destroy. And so even at Hanukkah, we're seeing this restoration of the cosmic order with the restoration of his people to him, to himself, and not to the ruling elites of the day. And of course, this is all leading us to the resurrection life, which will signify a new sheepfold, a new creation temple. So the idea of the good shepherd, this is not some peaceful scene of sheep and shepherd lying down in the pasture with, a babbling brook beside. He is making a dangerous statement in the domain of the people who are running the show. He is challenging these authorities. The very first verses of John chapter 10 says that he who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, and it says, but climbs in another way is a thief or a robber. And that's really a terrible translation because the word there is ascends. He who does not enter the sheepfold by the door, but ascends another way is a thief and a robber. Speaking either of the high priest or the king or both, who have illegitimate claims to the throne and the leadership of Israel. But he who ascends through the door is the shepherd of the sheep. And this I would maintain to be coronation language. It is the doorkeeper who opens the door, and that the sheep hear his voice, that Yeshua is the door, because the door signified a place of covenant obligations between the suzerain and the vassal, between the king and the servant, between the father and the son. That relationship, that covenant relationship, took place in doorways. Doorways were very important places in the ancient world where covenants were made and meals were confirmed, etc., etc. And the temple itself functioned as the place located between heaven and earth, the doorway, if you will, to heaven, the place where the priest would mediate. So that's all kind of interesting language. Once again, Yeshua declaring he is king, he is the good shepherd, he is the one who will rule and reign over the cosmic temple, the restoration of the entire cosmos where he is king. And it says that the shepherd calls his own sheep by name. It is that he gives them their identity. Identity was a very important attribute in the ancient world. They had lost their identity, if you will, when they went into exile, and when they returned because they were being oppressed by the dynasties of Hasmoneans and the Herodians. So he leads them out, and he brings out his own, and he goes ahead of them. And it tells us that the sheep hear his voice, follow his voice. That concept of voice or kol takes us back to Exodus 19, when the voice of God is on Sinai, and they have been brought out of Egypt. And it says, listen to my voice and keep my covenant, and you will be my own treasure, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Reminder what we had from Peter, living stones, and a kingdom of priests also mentioned in the book of Revelation. And so this idea of this treasured kingdom being brought out to build a tabernacle for the king to take his seat on the throne and for the presence of God to be restored, that the sheep will not follow a stranger. The Herodians were not of the royal line of the house of Judah. They were strangers who had usurped the temple. So the Hasmonean, they were not the legitimate kings. They were not in the legitimate lines. And so Yeshua is the rightful heir of the royal dynasty of King David, and that title that he takes on is as the descendant, that he is the good shepherd, that he lays down his life for the sheep, that he's not the hired worker, like the high priest was hired by Rome, but he is the rightful heir, that all the high priests were all hired by Rome. And so we see that he's saying that the high priest or the king will see the wolf coming and abandons the sheep, but he will never abandon the sheep. And so who is the wolf that scatters the sheep? It could be King Herod. It could be the high priest from Annas' family, Caiaphas. It could be Caesar. It could be Pilate. It could be all of the above. My feeling about this is that it's referring to Herod. And he is the one who will snatch the sheep and scatter them. So just as an aside at this particular time, to just kind of emphasize the power that Rome had over Herod, At the top of a gate of the temple, they erected a golden eagle, which was a symbol of Roman power, erected in the heart of Jerusalem. It was also said at the time of Augustus, Emperor Augustus, that he had ordered the priests to sacrifice 2 times a day on his behalf, on behalf of the Roman Senate, and on behalf of the people. So we just see this tragic state of unbelief of the Jewish leaders at the time. And enter into this environment comes Yeshua, the Messiah, the light of the world, the eternal light of the menorah. The menorah was associated with kingship, in particular the trunk. The wisdom being poured out from the idea connected to the oil. The deliverance of Yeshua's sheep to his sheepfold. Deliverance from captivity, because really, in essence, that's all that the children of Israel, of Judah at the time, really knew, was the concept of captivity under a foreign oppressor. And the imagery here of Yeshua taking them out of the temple unto him, who is the living tabernacle, the idea of returning to Eden's the place of the presence of God, the location of the tree of life, which the menorah signified, the place of the divine presence, and that in time after his resurrection, his followers, God's children, B'nai Elohim, will be partakers of that light. And with the light of the menorah being restored, it is a declaration that the rightful rulership has been restored. So we can see that the festival of the rededication of the temple, the festival of Hanukkah, goes far beyond just lighting a light, a menorah, that it is the restoration of order because the king has taken his seat on the throne of the cosmos. It's interesting to me, too, that the word light in Hebrew is or, out of which we can get order, to bring order into new creation life. And that is what Yeshua is declaring at that festival time in John chapter 10. And so we would conclude with John 11, because I think it connects together, that we have the resurrection of Lazarus shortly after Hanukkah. And so we have the themes of exile and return. And of course, where's Lazarus from? He's from the house from Bethany, Beit Anya or Beit Oni. Some say the house of affliction, which was beyond the Jordan. And that kind of reminded me of the Passover and the bread of affliction. And our forefathers went down to Egypt and were afflicted. And we tell the whole story of Passover called the Magid. And that in essence, if you read carefully through John 11, you will see that Lazarus himself was raised up on the 7th day. There was a couple of days where Yeshua didn't appear, and then it was 4 days in the tomb. So this idea of the 7th day, speaking of rest and shalom and peace and the rulership of the king, and that ultimately he would be raised up on the last day. But Hanukkah speaks to me of this ultimate deliverance from death, pointing the way to the resurrection, that the resurrection really basically means that the presence of God has been restored and returned to the temple. And in this case, the body of Messiah serving in that function, the body of Messiah being the light of the world. So this is just a different approach to Hanukkah. As I said, every year we teach and we try to go deeper and look at different aspects of the festival. But I think it's important for us to go back and review John 10, where we do have the only specific mention of Hanukkah in there, and understand this dynamic that's going on with the leadership, and then with the one who would come and say that I am indeed the good shepherd. I have come to restore all of the cosmos, and I have come to bring order where there's chaos, and to take that which has been corrupt and contaminated, and to make it whole, and to make it righteous, and to bring justice and order into this environment. So that's just a different way of viewing our Hanukkah festival. So I hope this year you guys have been enjoying your time with the family and your communities and your congregations as you celebrate Hanukkah. Let's remember, the Good Shepherd is the King seated on the throne who has brought order to all of the cosmos. Thanks for joining me. Shalom.